Well, joining me now from New York is the UN's spokesman for its peacekeeping unit, Nick Birnback. And in Washington, D.C., we have Brett Schaefer. He's the Senior Research Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. This is a fascinating story. Nick, let me start with you. 56 UN peacekeepers killed in 2017, doubled from the year before. It's a bad situation. Tell me why, in a nutshell, UN peacekeepers might need a new rule book, new rules of engagement.
Ultimately, it comes down to a question of mandates. If the Security Council gives us the mandate to do certain operations that require these new capacities, then we need them. And if we're going to go into places that are incredibly difficult, that have these austere environments, that have these challenges that involve us getting directly targeted, we need to have the ability to respond appropriately. Nobody is asking for us to have that in all contexts. In fact, I think that would be a mistake. What we are saying is that in contexts where we are sent to complete jobs that require these technologies and these capabilities, that we need to have them, we need to know how to use them, and we need to be able to execute the mandates we're assigned.
Brett Schaefer, so what Nick's basically saying is horses for courses, customized for different conflicts. Is that the best way to go about it, rather than having a kind of universal mandate?
Well, I think he's absolutely right. I've read the report. A number of the recommendations in there are very sound. In fact, they're very sound, so much so that they're not necessarily new. We've heard these complaints. We've made these recommendations in a number of different forums for a number of different years. The real significant change that's been going on is the fact that the UN Security Council is authorizing peacekeeping operations in far more dangerous environments than we've seen at least for quite some time, since the mid-1990s. And as a result of those more robust operations in more dangerous environments, inevitably we're going to see more casualties. It's appropriate for the United Nations and for the troop contributing countries and for the countries that authorize these operations to make sure that they have the capacity and the ability and the equipment necessary to protect themselves as much as possible. But as long as we're authorizing peacekeeping operations in dangerous environments, we're going to see casualties.
Yeah, and Nick, for those who say, well, if you add more teeth to the arsenal of the peacekeepers, at what point does it potentially become a tool for aggression and for attack, not defense? At what point do you stop being peacekeepers and just like any other army that's deployed, because you're going to act like any other army that's deployed?
Well, one of the points that the fatalities report that Brett just mentioned makes is that if you are in a military context and you are static and you are immobile and you project a weak posture, you are at risk. That you, in fact, are in you have a higher risk of being attacked. You are weaker. You have less ability to fulfill your mandate. In other words, sometimes the necessity to be strong actually is required if you're going to protect yourself. You need to be able to, if there's good evidence that you're about to be attacked, you need to be able to take proactive action. You need air assets to move quickly. That's just a fact. And if we're going to get put into these situations, the reality is that we need to be able to use those tactics. It doesn't mean that our fundamental mandates will change. We still deploy at the request of the Security Council, and they give us our mandates. But the point is that if we are going to successfully implement the mandates that we are being given, which involve the necessity to neutralize armed groups, in those contexts, we better be able to do it effectively.
Yeah. So, Brett, the previous mistakes and tragedies, right, was it by design? I mean, if these new recommendations were in place in the past in Rwanda or maybe in Srebrenica, would genocide have been prevented if the rule book was different, or was that going to happen invariably?
It's difficult or impossible to say what would have happened if circumstances had been different in those cases. You would hope that peacekeepers deployed would be more proactive, more willing to use violence and use their presence to protect civilians. Unfortunately, that hasn't occurred too many times in the past. But again, getting back to the main point here, we have a force intervention brigade in Congo that has a mandate to do many of the things that are outlined in this report, yet you still see fatalities by both UN personnel, civilian, and you also see fatalities of UN peacekeepers. So this is going to occur. The recommendations in the report, appropriate, I think sound in many different ways, are designed to address casualties that result from the specific problems that they've outlined. But when you ask a force, a peacekeeping force, to project itself into dangerous environments, to act proactively against adversaries and combatants in the field, you're going to also have casualties resulting from those actions as well. And it's not just UN peacekeeping that are facing these challenges. If you look at the African Union operation in Somalia, they've had over 3,000 casualties since 2007, a far higher rate than what we've seen in UN operations over that time, precisely because they are conducting many of the types of operations that we're talking about here against a very determined adversary. And that really gets to the fundamental point here. When you're talking about South Sudan, when you're talking about Mali, when you're talking about Congo, when you're talking about the Central African Republic, the UN has now inserted itself into conflict as a partisan force. And it's unrealistic to expect the UN to insert itself into a conflict like that and not be targeted as an adversary of these other forces.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Let's listen to the Under-Secretary General himself for peacekeeping operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. Have a little listen to what he had to say.
We're being attacked by armed groups who are looting, killing, raping, and they have no interest in peaceful solution. So it's because we have this very different dangerous environment that we have to change. And we have robust mandates, so we have mandates that enable us to respond to these challenges. But we're not doing well enough in terms of implementing these mandates.
And Nick, this is interesting. I mean, presumably this is the man you report to, right? And what he seems to suggest here is that these armed groups are not idiots. They're very smart, and they recognize the limitations of the UN peacekeeping mandate, and they gamed the system and in many ways treated UN peacekeeping soldiers, no matter which country they came from, as sitting ducks. Has that been the feeling, that you were basically sitting ducks and they could attack you with impunity?
I mean, I don't think that I agree that we've been sitting ducks. I think that we are in situations where we're disrupting the activities of these groups and they don't like it. We're in their way. And so since they have a lot at stake, they're on their home turf, they do take action against us. And they have done so very effectively, as the Undersecretary General just said, in a variety of the contexts that Brett just mentioned, in Mali, in Central African Republic, in South Sudan, in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, we've taken our share of action, too, in a variety of these contexts. And all of it is in furtherance of our mandate, protecting civilians and ensuring the delivery of humanitarian assistance and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that on the ground, we need to have the ability to take robust action when necessary against these groups. And what the ability means is that there's sort of three sides to it, in my view. The first is that we need to do a better job ourselves. Operationally, we need to be better. We need to be better prepared. We need to make sure that our people know what to do, and that we need to fix mistakes when we make them. And as the Undersecretary General said, we do make them. Then there's also the political side. At the end of the day, we aren't a war-fighting institution. We are fundamentally political. That means the council that sends us places needs to pass mandates that are achievable. It also means that there's a partnership aspect to it as well, which is the troop-contributing countries. We don't have our own army. We get military force from troop-contributing countries. Those people, those forces need to come equipped and trained and ready in terms of their mindset to undertake these types of actions if that is where we are going to be sent. The reason we're in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo protecting civilians is because we were sent there.
Right. Yeah, and of course, those rules of engagement were tweaked in 2012 in response to dire threats, and that was really interesting to follow. Let me ask you, because you mentioned these countries are putting forward their peacekeepers, right? Would some countries no longer want to put forward their forces if it means that they're more likely to be more sort of actively involved in fighting? Have they been consulted, maybe, as you put forward these recommendations?
If there are countries who don't want to send troops into these types of environments, that's fine. But let's know that now. Let's be entirely clear about what the job is, what the tasks they'll be asked to perform are, and only take forces from countries that are willing to provide troops that are appropriately trained, appropriately equipped, and have the mindset and the ethos to undertake those tasks. This is a hard business. It isn't as if going there is easy. So if we're going to go, let's go with the fighting chance to succeed in what we're being asked to do by the Security Council.
Right. So, Brett, I know you gave the example of Somalia and AU troops being attacked over there, and maybe that can be seen as a rebuttal to my next question, but humor me. for a second, right? If you have peacekeeping troops from, say, Bangladesh or Nepal, who are more likely to be treated as kind of foreign invaders by armed groups and so on, doesn't it make more sense, maybe, perhaps politically, to focus more on regional forces, like the African Union, ECOWAS, and so on, for example, in Africa, and other smaller regional forces in other parts of the world? Might they be less vulnerable to attack than blue helmets?
Well, I don't know if they're going to be less likely or less vulnerable to attack than blue helmets. But I think we need to be flexible in addressing these circumstances. If you have an unstable situation and you have regional governments who are willing to send their armed forces in to address these situations and are willing to accept the risks associated with that, then I think the Security Council should be very willing to bless those types of regional operations or even intervention operations where they see a legitimate threat to international peace and security. The reason why blue helmets have been treated differently in the past is because they were not war fighters. They were, traditional peacekeeping involves the consent of all parties to the conflict. The peacekeepers are neutral forces in terms of the conflict. They're designed to go in there and basically provide a cushion against an accidental or unintentional reignition of a conflict. That's traditional peacekeeping. What we're seeing now in places like South Sudan, Darfur, Mali, Congo, and other places is a far different type of operation where the UN peacekeepers are going in as a partisan in the conflict itself, and that brings along risks associated with that type of activity that you don't see in the past. And as a result, we're seeing higher casualties.
Right.
And I agree with the report that we need to be taking action to mitigate and prepare those troops for that potential. But we can't sit here and think that just adopting these changes in the report are going to result in zero casualties going forward. They're inherent in the type of operation that we're engaged in.
Yeah, very finally, Nick, in terms of trust, and I know you said that UN peacekeepers have made mistakes in the past, and that has been recognized by the Undersecretary General, by the Secretary General himself. With regards to trust, is trust globally in peacekeepers, as you're trying to sharpen your mandate, as high as it should be, given scandals in, for example, Haiti, where UN peacekeepers spread cholera, sex scandals in Congo, and so on? Is it harder nowadays to actually prove to people around the world that peacekeepers are there for peacekeeping and a force for good?
I think there's no question that peacekeeping has succeeded all the time. Of course it hasn't. And we've been very candid about that. This report is very candid. The Undersecretary General is very candid. All of us are, because we understand the cost of when we are unable to complete our mandates. And there's always good reasons for it, but that's not the point. The point is we need to do better. Having said that, the reality is that there are places all over the world that are more stable, have a greater chance for prosperity going forward, and are doing much better now because of many things, but also because of the intervention of United Nations peacekeepers. If you look at West Africa right now, for example, we're wrapping up our mission in Liberia in a month's time. That will be the last operation of West Africa. We had a mission in Sierra Leone next door and in the Ivory Coast next to that, and all three missions left behind places that have a reasonable chance for peace and are dealing with problems of being a developing state now instead of problems of fundamental security. That's progress, and those are the types of stories that we want to tell, while at the same time being quite hard-eyed at looking at when we have let the world down and committing to do better in trying to make sure we're able to fulfill these new complicated mandates that we are being assigned by the Security Council.
Okay, Nick Birnback and Brett Schaefer, I've got to move on, but I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.